The story of Samson is one of the most fascinating and dramatic tales in the Bible. Known for his unmatched strength, Samson was chosen by God to deliver the Israelites from their enemies, the Philistines. However, his life was marked by incredible victories, moral weaknesses, and a tragic ending. In this video, we will uncover the full story of Samson, a man who was both powerful and flawed, and whose journey teaches timeless lessons about faith, strength, and redemption. Samson's story begins during a period of great oppression for the Israelites. They had been under the harsh control of the Philistines for 40 years. The Philistines were powerful enemies, and the Israelites had been unable to free themselves from their grip. It was in this dark time that God chose to send a deliverer, a man whose life would be marked by incredible strength and an extraordinary calling. Samson's birth was foretold by an angel of the Lord to a woman who was barren. The angel appeared to her while she and her husband were preparing for the day, and he made an announcement that would change their lives forever. The angel told the woman that she would conceive and give birth to a son. This was a divine promise that her barren womb would bear fruit. But there was more to the prophecy. This child was to be set apart for God. The angel instructed that the boy would be a Nazirite, a special vow of dedication to God that would mark him from birth to death. As part of the Nazirite vow, Samson was not to drink any wine or fermented drink, nor was he to cut his hair. His dedication to God would be evident in the way he lived and the way he was set apart for God's service. The angel's message didn't stop there. He told Samson's mother that this child would begin to deliver Israel from the hands of the Philistines. God had chosen Samson for a great purpose. While his life would not be without challenges, Samson would be empowered by God's Spirit to fight the enemies of Israel. The Israelites were looking for someone to save them, and little did they know that this child, born to a humble couple, would grow up to be the very hero they needed. Samson's parents, though initially uncertain, accepted the angel's message with reverence. They understood that their son was destined for something extraordinary, and they followed the instructions carefully. As Samson grew, it became evident that God's hand was upon him. The Spirit of the Lord stirred within him, giving him extraordinary strength and courage. One of Samson's earliest displays of this supernatural power occurred when he encountered a lion. As he was traveling to the town of Timnah, he was confronted by a lion that attacked him. But with the strength that came from God, Samson tore the lion apart with his bare hands. It was a moment that demonstrated both his power and the divine favor that rested upon him. Later, as he passed by the carcass of the lion, he discovered that bees had made a hive in the dead body, and Samson took some of the honey from it, showing that even in a place of death, God could bring life. Samson's strength was a sign of God's provision for the people of Israel. However, it wasn't just brute strength that defined him, it was also his ability to perform acts of incredible daring and strategy, often motivated by his sense of justice and revenge against the Philistines. These early feats would become part of his legacy, showing the people that God was with him, even when his actions were sometimes reckless or impulsive. One of the most memorable acts that demonstrated Samson's strength occurred when he confronted the Philistines by attacking their crops. Samson was angered by the Philistines' actions against Israel, so he tied together 300 foxes' tails, attached torches to them, and set them loose in the Philistine fields. The fire spread quickly, burning their grain, vineyards, and olive orchards. It was a devastating blow to the Philistine economy, and it sparked a wave of retaliation. The Philistines, furious at this destruction, sent men to find Samson. But he was always one step ahead, escaping time and time again. His feats of strength and cunning were not only a reflection of his divine empowerment, but also of his unrelenting desire to fight back against the injustice Israel faced. Despite his extraordinary strength, Samson's character was deeply flawed. His impulsive nature often led him into morally questionable situations, particularly with women from the Philistines. One of these women was from the town of Timnah, where Samson had fallen in love with her. This relationship would mark the beginning of his struggles with his own desires and passions. While his parents urged him to marry an Israelite woman, Samson was determined to marry this Philistine woman, believing that it was part of God's plan to bring the Philistines into conflict with him. At the time, Samson did not fully realize that his love for this woman would soon set in motion a series of events that would lead to the unraveling of his personal strength and his divine mission. On his way to meet his future wife, Samson had another extraordinary encounter. A lion attacked him again, And once more, he was empowered by God's strength to defeat it. But the real significance of this event would unfold later when he was traveling to the same place. He found that bees had made a hive in the carcass of the lion, and he took some honey, which he shared with his parents. This seemingly trivial event would play a key role in his marriage feast, where Samson would present a riddle to his guests about the lion and the honey. When the Philistines could not solve the riddle, they resorted to deceit and tricked Samson's wife into revealing the answer, leading to a bitter conflict and further angering the Philistines. Samson's relationship with the Philistines continued to spiral as he moved deeper into enemy territory. Despite the power and potential he held, Samson's vulnerability to temptation became more apparent. It was clear that his physical strength was matched by a deep internal struggle. His love for the Philistine women, his desire for vengeance, and his inability to heed wise counsel from his parents and others would shape the course of his life and eventually lead to his downfall. Even though he was blessed with remarkable strength, Samson's greatest battles were not with the Philistines alone, they were with his own desires, his pride, and his inability to walk in complete obedience to God. The cycle of strength and weakness that marked his life would ultimately set the stage for the next chapter of his story, where betrayal, deception, and redemption would intersect. Samson's extraordinary feats might have been the product of divine strength, but the choices he made would determine whether he fulfilled God's purpose or fell victim to his own flaws. Samson's journey was not only marked by displays of extraordinary strength, but also by his internal struggles, particularly when it came to his desires and relationships. One of the most pivotal and tragic parts of his story involves his love for a woman from Timnah, a Philistine city. Despite the fact that his parents urged him to seek a wife from among the Israelites, Samson's heart was drawn to the Philistine woman. His attraction was more than just physical, it was part of a larger unfolding of God's plan, though Samson himself didn't realize it at the time. He believed that this marriage would provoke a confrontation with the Philistines, which would ultimately fulfill God's purpose for his life. But in doing so, Samson disregarded the warnings of his parents, as well as the deeper moral and spiritual implications of his choices. Samson's marriage to the Timnah woman was marred by deceit and conflict. During the wedding feast, Samson posed a riddle to his guests, which would later set the stage for even greater tension between him and the Philistines. The riddle was based on an experience he had with a lion, how he had slain the lion and later found honey inside its carcass. He asked his guests, out of the eater, something to eat out of the strong, something sweet. The Philistines were unable to solve the riddle and became increasingly frustrated. They threatened Samson's wife, using her to extract the answer to the riddle from him. Under intense pressure, she betrayed Samson, and she eventually extracted the answer. When Samson learned of her deceit, his rage was unleashed. In his fury, Samson left the marriage feast abruptly, and in a fit of anger, he sought revenge on the Philistines. He struck down 30 of them, took their possessions, and returned to his parents. His absence from the wedding and the act of violence he committed in retaliation for the betrayal strained his relationship with his wife. It became clear that Samson's impulsive nature and tendency toward revenge would not allow for peaceful resolutions. But it was this very conflict that would lead to his next momentous act. A time later, Samson returned to his wife, hoping to reconcile and renew their marriage. But when he arrived, he was told by his father-in-law that his wife had been given to another man. This news, once again, ignited Samson's fury. In a fit of rage, he launched a brazen act of retaliation against the Philistines. As revenge for what they had done, he set fire to their fields and crops by tying torches to the tails of 300 foxes and releasing them into the fields. This destructive act caused massive devastation to the Philistine agricultural system, resulting in enormous losses for the Philistine economy. The Philistines, enraged, retaliated by burning Samson's wife and father-in-law to death, an act that added fuel to Samson's fury. The tension between Samson and the Philistines escalated, and the violence between them grew more intense. Samson was no longer simply a judge of Israel, but a man who had become deeply entangled in personal vendettas and conflicts. His actions reflected his internal struggles, his desires for revenge, his tendency to act impulsively, and his unyielding pride. This would set the stage for one of the most famous and tragic chapters of his life, his encounter with Delilah, a woman who would be his ultimate downfall. Delilah was another woman from the Philistine territory, and like the others in Samson's life, she would play a pivotal role in his fate. The Philistine rulers, having suffered countless humiliations and defeats at the hands of Samson, saw an opportunity to finally bring him down by exploiting his love for Delilah. They bribed her with a large sum of money to discover the secret to Samson's strength. Delilah, aware of Samson's affection for her, was willing to betray him for the promised reward. Samson's love for Delilah blinds him to her true intentions. Over a series of encounters, Delilah repeatedly asked Samson to reveal the source of his immense strength. 3 times, Samson lied to her, telling her false answers to test her resolve. First, he claimed that if he were bound with 7 fresh bowstrings, he would lose his strength. Delilah, believing him, did exactly as he said, but when the Philistines came to capture him, Samson broke free, leaving them with nothing. Undeterred, Delilah pressed him again, and the second time he told her that if he were bound with new ropes, he would be weakened. Delilah again followed his instructions, and once again the Philistines came to seize him. But Samson broke free yet again, and the ruse was exposed. The third time, Delilah became increasingly frustrated and accused him of lying to her. She wept and begged him for the truth, arguing that if he truly loved her, he would tell her the secret. She wore him down with her constant pleas and manipulations, and at last, Samson revealed the truth to her. "No razor has ever been used on my head, because I have been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." Delilah knew she had finally obtained the answer she had been searching for. The Philistines, who were hiding nearby, rejoiced at the news. Delilah lulled Samson to sleep on her lap, and while he rested, she summoned a man to shave his head, cutting off the source of his strength. When Samson awoke, he felt no different at first, but as he tried to rise and fight, he realized that his strength had departed. He had been betrayed, and the power that had defined him, the power given to him by God, was gone. The Philistines seized Samson, gouged out his eyes, and took him to Gaza, where he was imprisoned and forced to grind grain like a slave. His once invincible strength had left him, and the mighty man who had terrorized the Philistines was now a broken and humiliated figure. His fall from grace was not just physical but spiritual. Samson had allowed his desires and emotions to overshadow his calling, and in doing so, he had forfeited the very strength that made him an instrument of God's will. While in prison, Samson's hair began to grow back, a subtle but powerful reminder of the vow he had taken to God. Though he was now in captivity, God had not abandoned him. His physical weakness became a symbol of his need for God's strength. Little did Samson know, this period of captivity would set the stage for his final redemptive act. Even in his darkest hour, God would use him once more to accomplish his divine purposes. After Samson was betrayed by Delilah, the Philistines' revenge was swift and brutal. They captured him, gouged out his eyes, and dragged him to Gaza, one of their major cities. There, they humiliated him in the most severe way. Samson, once the towering figure of strength, was now a blinded prisoner, bound in chains and forced to grind grain like an animal. The very man who had torn apart lions, slain thousands, and struck fear into the hearts of the Philistines was now reduced to a pitiable state of captivity, his once mighty form barely recognizable. The loss of Samson's physical strength was not only a personal tragedy, but also a symbol of how far he had fallen from his calling. The Philistines took great pleasure in his humiliation. They brought him out in public, displaying him as a trophy of their victory. The mighty warrior who had long terrorized them was now a subject of mockery and derision. They mocked his strength and taunted him, reveling in the sight of his blindness. His fall from grace seemed complete, and his life appeared to be over, his purpose as a deliverer of Israel seemingly destroyed. Yet, in the midst of his imprisonment and suffering, something profound was happening. Samson's physical eyes may have been gouged out, but there was still a chance for his spiritual eyes to be opened. During his time in the prison, as he was grinding grain day after day, Samson was forced to reflect on his life, his choices, and his failures. This period of suffering became a time of deep introspection and ultimately repentance. His once prideful and impulsive nature began to give way to humility and a renewed sense of dependence on God. Samson's strength had always come from the Spirit of the Lord, but now, in his weakness and brokenness, he began to realize that his strength was never his own. It had always been a gift from God, and it was only through God's mercy and grace that he could ever be restored. The Philistines, meanwhile, were oblivious to the inner transformation taking place in Samson's heart. They were focused on celebrating their victory. As the years passed, Samson's hair began to grow back, a subtle sign that God had not abandoned him. To the Philistines, Samson's fate seemed sealed. They believed that the great hero of Israel was gone for good, powerless and broken beyond repair. The sight of his growing hair, however, would mark the beginning of a new chapter in Samson's life, one that would bring him closer to fulfilling the purpose for which he had been born. The Philistines, in their triumph, gathered to celebrate their victory in the grand temple of their god, Dagon, which stood in the heart of their city. This event was a huge occasion, and the leaders of the Philistine cities came together to offer thanks to their god for delivering Samson into their hands. They wanted to commemorate their conquest of the mighty Israelite and praise their god for his supposed superiority over the God of Israel. In their arrogance, the Philistines did not realize that they were about to witness a moment that would turn their victory into defeat and expose the true power of the God of Israel. During the festivities, Samson was brought out of his prison cell to entertain the crowd. His humiliation was complete. He was made to stand in front of thousands of Philistine men and women, including their rulers and leaders. They laughed and jeered at him, mocking his once great strength. They likely saw him as a symbol of their dominance over Israel, a reminder that the gods they worshipped had triumphed. But they underestimated the power of the god Samson served. Samson, though physically weak, still held within him the spark of divine strength. He asked a servant to guide him to the two central pillars of the temple, which supported its massive structure. As Samson stood there, between the pillars, he quietly called out to God, his heart fully surrendered to the Creator. For the first time in a long while, he recognized that his strength had never come from himself. It had always been a gift from God. In a moment of deep humility and repentance, he prayed, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." It was a prayer of desperation, but also a prayer of faith. Samson recognized that he could not rely on his own strength anymore. He needed God's help. In his darkest moment, he turned to God, asking for a final act of deliverance. God, in his mercy, answered Samson's prayer. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him once again, and Samson, with his hands resting on the pillars, summoned the strength that he had lost. With all his might, he pushed against the 2 pillars. The force of his strength, renewed by the Spirit of God, was enough to bring the entire temple crashing down. The building, filled with thousands of Philistines, including their rulers, collapsed and Samson died with them. The Bible tells us that Samson killed more people in his death than he had during his lifetime. In that final moment, Samson's purpose was filled. He had brought judgment upon the Philistines and, in a powerful act of redemption, completed the mission that God had given him. Samson's death was both tragic and triumphant. It was tragic because it marked the end of a life filled with wasted potential, impulsive choices, and personal failure. But it was triumphant because, in his final act, Samson demonstrated true dependence on God. He recognized his need for divine intervention and was willing to submit to God's will, even in his final moments. His death was a sacrifice, but it was also a victory for God's people over their enemies. Samson's story serves as a powerful reminder that no matter how far we fall, no matter how much we fail, God's grace is always available for redemption. Samson's strength was never about his physical power. It was about God working through him to accomplish his purposes. Even in the end, when Samson was at his lowest point, God used him for his glory. Though his life had been marked by moments of pride and weakness, Samson's final act showed that God can use even the most broken and flawed people to fulfill his plans. In the aftermath of Samson's death, the Philistines would be left to mourn their loss and reflect on their arrogance. For Israel, Samson's death was a moment of deliverance, but it was also a somber reminder of the consequences of disobedience and the need to rely on God for strength. Samson's life, though filled with triumphs and failures, ultimately points to the truth that God's power can work through anyone, even the weakest, the most flawed, and the most broken if they are willing to surrender to his will. Samson's story is one of profound tragedy and triumph, and his death was not the end of his legacy. After his death, his story continued to resonate with the people of Israel, and his life left an indelible mark on the history of the nation. Although Samson had fallen victim to his own weaknesses and desires, his final act of faith and the victory he achieved in his death served as a reminder to Israel of God's sovereignty, grace, and the power of repentance. The Israelites, after years of oppression under the Philistines, were finally delivered from their enemies through Samson's final act. However, their deliverance did not come without a cost. The mighty hero they had long awaited was gone, and though he had defeated the Philistines in that last, explosive moment, his death left Israel to pick up the pieces and continue their struggle. The Israelites had not seen Samson as a perfect hero, but in his final act, they witnessed the power of God at work through a man who had been broken, but was willing to be used by God to accomplish his will. Samson's life was filled with extraordinary feats of strength, but his greatest victory came not through his physical power, but through his humble reliance on God. His failure to fully live out the calling placed on his life, however, would serve as a cautionary tale to Israel for generations to come. His story spoke to the danger of relying too heavily on one's own abilities, the danger of neglecting spiritual obedience, and the importance of turning back to God in repentance when all seems lost. After Samson's death, the Philistines, who had once celebrated his fall, now had to contend with the reality that their greatest enemy had struck a final blow to their kingdom. His death left the Philistines weakened, and although they didn't know it immediately, they would never fully recover from the loss of Samson's strength and influence. The collapse of the Philistine temple was a symbolic end to an era. The laughter and mockery that had once surrounded Samson's captivity were replaced by fear and uncertainty. The Philistines had long thought themselves invincible, their gods powerful, and their rulers untouchable, but Samson's death exposed their vulnerabilities and their inability to stand against the God of Israel. The Philistines, knowing they could not simply ignore the power that had been displayed in Samson's death, would have to re-evaluate their strategies in dealing with Israel. In the wake of the destruction Samson caused in his final act, they were forced to reconsider their position in relation to the Israelites. The Philistine leaders who had once laughed and reveled in Samson's downfall were now faced with the consequences of their pride. It was a sobering moment for them, though they might not have fully understood the implications of their defeat. They had witnessed a mighty judgment from God, and their gods had been shown to be powerless in the face of the one true God. For Israel, Samson's death marked both a moment of deliverance and a lesson in the dangers of living apart from God's guidance. While Samson had delivered Israel in a very physical sense, his life was a testament to the destructive power of sin when left unchecked. His failure to fully adhere to the Nazirite vow, his impulsive nature, and his inability to follow God's commandments all contributed to his downfall. However, in his final moments, Samson repented and called upon God for strength, showing that God's grace and mercy are available even to the most broken and flawed. His story stands as a stark reminder to Israel that obedience to God is paramount, and that relying on one's own strength, rather than on God, leads to ruin. Samson's story also had a profound effect on the collective memory of Israel. His name would be remembered not only for his incredible feats of strength, but also for the lessons learned from his failures. Israel, though delivered through his strength, was still a nation in need of spiritual renewal. Samson's life served as a reminder of the tension between physical strength and spiritual weakness, and how God's power can be revealed even through human imperfection. His story would echo through the generations as a warning to future leaders and judges of Israel. In the years following Samson's death, Israel would continue to struggle with the Philistines, but Samson's legacy would inspire a deeper understanding of what true strength meant. The people would come to realize that true strength was not in physical might, but in their relationship with God, their obedience to His commandments, and their trust in His power. Israel would eventually be led by other judges, prophets, and kings, but the lessons from Samson's life would shape their approach to leadership and faithfulness to God. Samson's death marked the end of an era of judges in Israel, but it also marked the beginning of a period of reflection. In his lifetime, he had been both a symbol of God's power and a reminder of the consequences of disobedience. His ultimate victory over the Philistines was not just a physical triumph, it was a spiritual statement that God was still in control, even in the most dire of circumstances. Despite Samson's failures, God used him for His purposes, and that fact alone brought hope to Israel. Samson's final moments of prayer were crucial to his redemption. It was in that moment of surrender, asking for strength to defeat his enemies, that he found grace. His ability to humble himself before God and ask for help, despite everything that had happened in his life, was a reflection of God's willingness to forgive and restore. This moment serves as a poignant reminder to all who read his story that God's grace is greater than any of our failures, and that repentance and reliance on God can lead to true victory, no matter the circumstances. Samson's legacy did not end in death. The memory of his final act of courage and faith would echo in the hearts of the Israelites for generations to come. His story would be told not just as a tale of strength, but as a testimony to God's ability to work through imperfect people to accomplish his will. Samson's life and death point to the greater truth that, while human strength is fleeting, God's power is eternal. Even in the midst of failure, God can use us for his glory if we are willing to turn back to him in faith and obedience. The impact of Samson's story would continue to shape the history of Israel, as the people would remember him not just as a strong man, but as one who ultimately learned to trust in God. His life, filled with both great victories and profound failures, serves as a powerful reminder of the grace of God and the need for humility, repentance, and reliance on his strength. Samson's final triumph became not only a personal victory for him, but also a victory for Israel and a declaration of the sovereignty of God over all.